just want to have a very rich discussion today about what we in the HR space can do to do exactly what the title indicates, and that is culturally transforming the HR industry. So whether you are in DEI space, in organizational development or talent acquisition, whatever your space may be, or you're not even involved in HR, we hope that you'll walk away with some great insights and some nuggets. So I wanted to start off with discussing what I read recently from SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resources Management. And it's from their CEO, Johnny Taylor. And he recently stated that companies will not be diverse without a commitment from the full C-suite that extends to hiring, starting with a chief diversity officer, or what's known as a CDO, that is vetted, valued, and remunerated at the same level as a company CEO. So I wanted to present to the panel the first question. In what ways does your company state and demonstrate commitment and leadership on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what are the benchmarks? So Creighton, can we start with you?
Sure. Number one, thank you everyone for allowing us to be a part of this conversation with you all. To go directly to that question, I definitely agree directly with the fact that unless it starts at the top, it starts with your CEO or your C-suite, it's never, in many cases, going to be able to be as in-depth or impactful as it needs to be. So that is an absolute thing I think that has to happen. Now, it also has to happen, though, that if it is not integrated, meaning if you have a CDO, if you have a chief diversity officer, if that CDO is not also integrated into the rest of the organization, then it also doesn't have the impact that you're really trying to push for. One of the things that we've tried to do is, and we have actually created a position, a chief diversity officer, chief culture impact type officer position. But what we did first was that we wanted to layer that with making sure that we had that position be able to touch all the other departments. It had to be cross-departmental. It couldn't be trapped or isolated itself. With that isolation, the fear is that it will not just be something about your culture or your organization. It will be just simply another product or another promotion. As we all know, promotions only go but so far and normally have a date on them when they expire. This is something that is not built to do this. This is something, a sustainable movement, that if you're really trying to build the talent levels of your organization, if you're trying to treat whatever a customer base you may have, this diversity, equity, and inclusion is what you must be able to do, and it can't be done in isolation effectively. So a real focus on making sure it's integrated throughout the rest of the organization, regardless of department. Then, of course, that's when you actually strategically have a diversity council of some sort that you build together. But once again, if that's not representative of all and given the clearance to really be autonomous, and that CEO is now being able to pull on all of those different things, that gets trapped. We really tried to focus on that as we're continuing to push through our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey.
Juanita, you're on mute.
So sorry. So Tracy, I'd like to get your input on that and what the state is doing, and if you already know what your new role will entail in demonstrating that commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So as many of you may or may not know, Governor Cooper has the most diverse cabinet in the history of North Carolina. from gender and race. And that is by design, not by mistake. And so the interesting part about that for each of us that either lead these organizations or are one downs that are also very diverse folks as well, that we're bringing that experience to the table to change the way we view this in North Carolina. The governor has been very, very vocal about the work that we need to do, particularly after the unrest around the death of George Floyd, and what we all must do to make that commitment to our staff and to ourselves has been critically important. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The piece, though, for us in the state of North Carolina is we don't have a formal chief diversity officer like you would normally see in the private sectors. Most of those roles fall to our human resource or human capital management folks within each of the agency. And then, of course, that is matrix to an overall Office of State Human Resources group that kind of establishes some of those policies. It's only been the last couple of years that I've looked at the statistics and what we're doing and how we're creating a richer pool of candidates when we are recruiting for information technology related positions, and even those that may not be IT but have a different kind of slant that we need. And I think our HR director has been working very hard. I will say we have a lot of work to do. Looking at some of the statistics over the last few years, we could absolutely do better. I think we do a lot better on gender diversity than we do on anything else. But we are putting in new programs to encourage how we build that rich pool, whether it's through additional pipelines in other areas like HBCUs, these other engagements for internships and summer programs that allow more people of color to understand what we do at the state. And it's not just, the old way of thinking about technology within the state, but also educating so that we can recruit a more diverse workforce to even apply for the jobs that we have. I know there's been a lot of comments about folks saying, well, we just don't get the right pool of candidates. We don't get enough diversity in the candidate pool. But that also requires some accountability and responsibility on the agencies to reach out and figure out how we educate them, how we find them, how we help them understand whether it's a racial diversity, gender diversity, age, all of those things. Because within my agency specifically, we have 30% of our staff of 1,200 that could retire any minute. And that's pretty significant. But it's also an opportunity to find a different way of recruiting in order to get a diverse workforce, which is what we're really angling for at DIT. The other area that we have is a very strong culture initiative here at the Department of IT. Is when you look at technology across an enterprise, we are transforming leaps and bounds as it relates to broadband and digital transformation and cybersecurity and all of those things. And so in an effort to build the right culture in order to create this new environment that we're trying to create, it includes diversity of thought, diversity of people, and that is a very large portion of our culture program that also has measurements associated with it, because as we all know, if you have a more diverse workforce, they're more productive, they're happier, you get more employee engagement, innovation increases. And so those are easy measurements for us in technology to make in order to understand that the actions that we do around diversity are really making a difference.
Thank you so much. And Ben, if I can just get you to chime in a little bit and just briefly talk
Sure.
about what you're doing within your consultancy.
Sure. Well, well, first, thank you for having me. I've been working with companies across the United States and internationally, trying to help leaders think about these issues in a different way. So I've been at this for 50 plus years. And I've obviously seen change over the years, but the change for the most part hasn't been structural and systemic. You know, it's been a couple of people here and there, but we really haven't approached issues, particularly issues of race, in a real systemic, structural way. I recently wrote an article called The 518 Conversation. And what the 518 Conversation is, it's a call to people in the C-suite to have a conversation about May 18th, 1 week before George Floyd's murder. And the conversation goes like this: why haven't I, as a leader, had any interest, significant interest, in the kinds of things that I suddenly 1 week later am interested in? C-suite leaders across the country are throwing millions of dollars, creating initiatives, et cetera. Everyone is, you know, talking about Black Lives Matter. Why 1 week before George Floyd's murder was that not on the radar? And what does that say individually about C-suite leaders? And then secondly, what does that say about organizational leadership? So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're at a different moment, but I have, you know, experienced this place a few times over the years. And so I'm gonna withhold judgment and see 8-10 months from now whether this really is a different moment in terms of systemic and structural change, or whether we're continuing to sort of nibble around the edges.
Thank you. So in thinking about that, Creighton, as you know, valuing racial equity examines organizational practice that supports equitable outcomes, as Tracy was just saying and Ben was just saying. So what recommendations do you have for organizations to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout their business, or at least through a talent management framework?
Okay. And I'm going to link the conversation back to what we meant before, because truly the biggest recommendation that I have, that I've seen with organizations that were on the path to doing it a little bit better, is that they did not get isolated. I have seen, and I'm sure Benjamin will be able to really reiterate this also, where you've seen chief diversity officer type positions that are created in organizations, but they're given no support. They're given no connection to the rest of the organization. Their metrics that are created are basically created only for them to do and not really to be shared out, but only if it is in a protectionary standpoint. You see it in financial industries a lot, where you will see much of this work sometimes is only done from a Community Reinvestment Act type of group of community development, and that you have 4 metrics and that's it, but you don't see that connection with the rest of the organization. The recommendation has to be that in whatever infrastructure you create, it has to be something that is, once again, integrated. Where I get even more direct here is the integration as to HR. And what is the HR role in this? Considering a lot of the metrics that you're going to see runs through the power of what HR does, whether it's compensation issues. I like to talk about the fallacy of what I call rationalized compensation practices. Because in many cases, you know, we have rationalized why we will pay certain people one thing and why we pay other people other things. And sometimes you have leadership that if it is too fragmented, the leadership becomes the powerful one in the group that says, well, I want to do this, and I have just rationalized my reason, whether it made sense to the qualifications or not. And now you have the discrepancy, you have all the different types of discriminatory practices that comes into that. How does an integrated HR into the system that's not just set up as something that is a complement to whatever the seniors are saying, but no, truly as the protection for the organization, the protection for the employees, the protection for those leaders themselves to understand here is a skill set here that is probably one of the highest skill sets that you can have. If you don't protect your people and your talent, then it's hard to protect any productivity you're trying to do. So the way HR can be structured in organizations where it's autonomous, it can stand on its own in its connectivity to everything else, not take the orders of the strongest leader. That's where I think, once again, as a recommendation, being able to do that gives you that much more protection, gives you that much more production. And someone had a question in the chat room that I'm going to tie right to that if the CEO is actually part of the problem, an autonomous HR, which has the support and backing of protecting the organization and its employees, can actually be able to help influence at sometimes peer pressure with compensation process, with different hiring processes, with how do you recruit today, can actually hopefully influence those CEOs, those C-suites who really don't get it, don't want to get it, but may be forced into a business decision, like you're seeing a lot of the cosmetic changes of the last little bit, that all of a sudden things that hadn't moved in 50 years can have now a flag change in 48 hours. Or we can see a nickname for a football team, I won't mention it, you know who it is, that, people can say, no, I will not change it. It will be over my dead body, and in less than 3 days, next thing you know, they're making an announcement saying they're changing. Lots of other influences happen, but at some point in some of those conversations, that power was not allowed to continue to just be where it ruled over everything, and there had to be an HR role in there somewhere that's pushing that helps say change has to happen today.
Thank you for that. So as we move in the conversation, and one of the things Ben mentioned, and all of us, are very well aware of, is the increased support for Black Lives Matter and racial equity. And this is from almost every industry. And as I was saying in the opening, it's pretty much galvanized us nationally and internationally. This all is going on amidst a global pandemic, business shutdowns, and levels of unemployment. So as we rebound as a nation, how can we as HR become allies and transformative change agents within our own company? And Creighton, you did an excellent job kind of summarizing that shortly, but to the three of you, what can we do as a profession?
So I'd like to chime in here just for a second from a technology point of view, and for human resources to recognize that digital divide is real. And for those who don't have access to high-speed internet, they're not going to be able to apply for jobs on the internet. They're not going to be able to do a lot of the research that everybody else can do. And that partnership with those companies or entities that are focused on that work, I think is important. And also thinking about where you are focusing your time, particularly in North Carolina. You've got a rural community that just doesn't have the same access as everyone else. During the pandemic, I've worked with a nonprofit that deals with high-risk girls. Those girls living in the southeast Raleigh are really struggling to get their schoolwork, to understand what's happening in the world, because they don't have access to devices and high-speed internet. I do think from an HR point of view, it is not a silo, but it is something to be worked on and collaborated with others too, because those things matter. There's a reason why we don't always get the rich pool of candidates. There's a reason why we don't have as many people in the conversation. And with the pandemic going on and the unrest and everything that's going on, that has become more and more prevalent, this digital divide. And at DIT, that's been a really significant thing for us. But I think for HR in particular, I don't know how you deal with that, how you take that into consideration when you are recruiting and evaluating candidates for roles, and how you go out into the community and recruit.
I
Creighton
think
or Ben,
HR
did
can
you have?
help. Well, I was just going to say, I agree with Tracy totally. Um, and HR can really help in thinking in a transformative way about talent, what skills and competencies are appropriate for different positions. Because a skilled, talented, competent person of color might have a different pedigree than someone who's white. If you think of the disparities around the attainment of wealth, if you think of how that feeds into what schools you go to, what schools are considered top schools, housing, etc. So a talented, competent candidate might not have the pedigree and might not look on paper like someone with a different kind of background. Now, I remember hiring once someone who was an expert in training. He happened to come from the prison system. But in terms of particular skills and competencies, he had it. So I think one of the challenges as we, look in a more structural, systemic way at a lot of issues related to race and diversity is to really think in a transformative way about what does a top skilled, competent person look like? In higher education, we began to get into this 2 or 3 decades ago when we realized that to be a college or university president, you didn't have to be a provost. And so some schools took a risk and got a politician, then a corporate executive. And all of a sudden, focusing on skills and competencies, we have college presidents and university presidents with a host of different backgrounds, but they have the specific skills and competencies. So I think HR can be really helpful in thinking in a transformative way about the pedigree of top talent and how it might present itself in a unique or a non-traditional way.
Okay. All right. So, Tracy, I wanted to go back to you for a moment because one of the things that I read was a statement. And when the protests began, you issued some comments to North Carolina employees within your division. And I wanted to take a moment to share it with everyone because it was very powerful. So it says, I am deeply saddened and outraged by the unfathomable killing of George Floyd. This is not an isolated incident. It is the result of pervasive racism that we all must fight against together. I have a son, husband, brother, uncles whose safety weighs on my mind constantly. My son places his wallet in plain sight in his car so he doesn't have to reach for it if he were stopped for any reason. Nothing I say or do can assuage his fear, my daughter's fear, or my own. At NCDIT, we have no room for racism or violence, and it persists in opposition to our core values as public servants. For me, and I know for many of you, processing this grief and anger is all the more difficult in the context of COVID-19. We all are coping with these crises from our own homes without the ability to be with our community. I care deeply about each of you, and I want you to know that your DIT family is here for you. Please be in touch with your supervisors, with me, if you need to discuss anything, and then you give some resources. I ask that in your personal and your professional lives, you reflect and consider how you can help. Perhaps it's a discussion with your peers about what you are feeling, asking questions about things you don't understand, being sensitive and respectful to those who are hurting and struggling emotionally. The work we do at NCDIT is helping address disparities that disproportionately affect Black people and communities of color and to build stronger communities. I encourage you to commit to serving the people of this state, fighting against racism wherever you see it, and helping your community. fellow employees, and fellow North Carolinians during this emergency. Our society is screaming, but it is imperative that we treat each other with respect in the midst of this injustice. While I am sad and angry to see racism still so prevalent in our country, I also have hope. Hope that we can all come together as a family, as a community, as human beings to make change. As we build the culture we want to see, this moment is where we start. That was powerful. So, as secretary of NCDIT, how have these events increased your commitment to improve racial or economic disparities within the digital divide? And how can we be more intentional? And you spoke to it a minute ago, but as HR, how can we be more intentional about how we recruit underrepresented talent?
Well, and I think the other piece is retain underrepresented talent too. And so when we're not having candid conversations about what's really happening in our communities, then we're acting like it doesn't exist. And so for my senior leadership team, which also includes our HR director, I had very candid conversations. What do you think? Ask me a question. What do you want to know? What do you think I should know? And so that we could open up those channels for communication, because we weren't talking about it at all. It was, to me, it felt like something I was talking about at home with my African American family, but we weren't talking about it in the work family. And in order for us to create this culture that we said we want to have, it starts, as Creighton mentioned, it starts at the C-level suite on down. And so if we're not having the conversations, we can't expect the employees to have a conversation and really recognize where we need to help each other and learn about each other and understand and point out wrong when we see it, so that we can continue to retain people. The amount of emails I got from individual staff members, excited that they got a note like that, which they've never gotten before in the state around an issue like this, but also, really looking forward to having conversation with their peers. And they wouldn't have thought to do that. And I think as HR directors, that should be something that should be done all the time. It shouldn't just be me at the top doing it. It should be something that we do all the time. It should be something that we all stand together and say, okay, what's going to be the communication plan for this? What's going to be the action plan for this? So it's not just me in a vacuum sending an email based on what was heavy on my heart, but something that each of the senior leadership team could also be providing to their staff in their individual meetings to open up a conversation. Not everybody is going to know how to do that. Even some of my peers in cabinet agencies, one of my really close peers who happens to be white, called me and said, okay, I don't have the same experience you have, but help me understand how I address this with my own agency. And I thought that was great. I applauded him for doing that. And we helped write something together. But the fact that we were doing it in a vacuum and pretty inconsistently across the agencies is probably not where we want to be. It would be better to have, a more consistent understanding, voice, and approach for how that gets done, so that those key points always remain, and the understanding for what we will stand for and what we won't stand for is quite clear all the time. And I think HR has a responsibility there, as well as the employees and the executives in an organization.
Thanks. Ben or Creighton, did you need to add anything?
Well, I just wanted to say that was a real powerful statement, Tracy. And one of the things I focused on was the fact that the experience that you have, that your son has, is different than the experience of other people. And I think part of what the dialogue can help us do is to try to understand the variety of experiences. But I would caution all of us, and I caution people I work with, is to not assume that the dialogue is synonymous with change. That the dialogue is critical, but it's not synonymous with change. And I think the dialogue needs to happen, certainly, as we've all said, at the C-level, C-suite level. It needs to happen in homogeneous groups and heterogeneous groups. And I'll give you an example. So I've been meeting at a few organizations with groups that have only Black identified employees, and then groups with white, then people of color, and then mixed groups. An interesting thing has happened, not surprising, that when a meeting with Black identified groups, there's this sigh of relief that they're on Zoom. They said, I'm the only one in my office, or the only one of 2 or 3. Whew, what a relief. I don't have to experience that. So along with everyone, they're talking about the challenges of being on Zoom, et cetera, Zoom fatigue. And in addition to that, there's this sigh of relief that I'm not sure they would express in mixed company. But as they express it, you see people on Zoom nodding, saying, I know what you mean, brother. I know what you mean, sister. Whew, I don't have to experience that. And that's powerful. So I do think that the dialogue is critical, but it's not sufficient to move us as a nation.
If I can also add one other point to that, and I'm going to come back to the role of HR in this dialogue. It's not a conversation for many if they don't feel safe having the conversation.
Yeah.
And is in many cases where you saw some success from some of the organizations that have done like listening sessions or things to that nature where some of these conversations can really be brought together, there was a voice coming from that was coming directly from HR to basically say, this is safe. You can't move to any of this unless you feel that it was safe, because, hey, if you're in rooms where you think there's managers or people who don't believe in this, are you more willing to have that conversation? If you think that there could be some type of corporate pushback on you, are you willing to have that conversation? You can't even get to that dialogue. There is something about, once again, the powers of HR being the conscience of any organization and really being able to say, you know something, we're going to walk this conversation out with whoever C-suite leader is there. We're going to be there to be protective of what you're saying, that you're not going to have any retaliation. That's the only way you can have any honest dialogue to even get to the points that Ben and Tracy so eloquently put together.
Thank you for that. So as we think about everything that HR does and can do, and having those courageous conversations, some of the courageous conversations I've had, and maybe some of you have had, is when I ask companies to recruit more persons of color, or you may see it as POCs for any position. Some of my colleagues say that there is not enough available and qualified candidates of color in the pool. And you spoke about it, several of you spoke about it a moment ago. While they want to do it, they walk the line of being mindful and adhering to laws pertaining to the hiring practices. So what are your thoughts regarding these assertions, and what can HR do? And Tracy, you spoke to it a moment ago, to broaden that net to recruit and retain and hire diverse talent.
So if I could go back to something that Ben said, and I think it's incumbent upon not just HR, but also, hiring managers, directors, and executives, that because we write job descriptions and postings and things like that so strict that you can't work outside of those things, that it doesn't leave room for cross-discipline education and experience and background, or someone that might not have the right pedigree that they're looking for, but have the right experience. And I think there's got to be a way to have those conversations with HR so that they feel safe when we talk about hiring more people of color, but also providing them the right tools and background rather than saying, I just need to have this, this, and this, but the willingness to open it up and say, okay, but if this and this together could also provide that the meet the needs of that skill set or expertise, that's also what we're looking for. I think we've got to really look a lot deeper than I just need a computer engineer. Well, you also need somebody with business acumen. You also need someone that understands, finance specifically and how we run our business. And so I think, HR doesn't always understand that, but I think it's incumbent upon HR as well as the hiring folks to be able to have those real conversations so that it does open that pool up a little bit more so that everyone are able to apply to something that is meaningful and feel like they could bring value to an organization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
I agree. Yep. Yeah. And, and managers, supervisors, certainly people in the C-suite need to ask the person who brings to them the final slate. So how have you searched in a diverse way? I mean, just what is your process? We're not asking for one of these, two of those, but explain to me in some detail what your search process was about. Because I think very often some managers and supervisors will put an ad in a couple of, ethnically oriented magazines, journals. Maybe they'll send a job description to someone online. That's not an aggressive search if you want to widen the pool. So I think if executives start asking people to explain in detail, and that's part of the process. Part of the process is you don't go from A to B until you explain the process so that you can be assured that the process at least seems to be equitable, fair, and that you search broadly.
Russell just made a great point a moment ago, and basically said recruiter has great influence on required versus preferred qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
So in
Yeah.
thinking about that, any audience members, if you want to chime in to what Ben was saying, or Creighton or Tracy, or ask some questions, we encourage you to do so in the chat, and we'll have an opportunity to dedicate time as well to answering your questions. So one question for you, Ben, is how can organizations best equip themselves with those perspectives? And that's actually for any of you on the panel. How can they best equip themselves?
Yeah. One of the places to start, and I think Creighton and Tracy have been saying this, is in the C-suite. I mean, without leadership, if you're going to try to create a more equitable environment in an organization, and you're going to try to do it from the ground up, I mean, it can happen, but boy, the people on the ground don't have control over the levers of power, resources, etc. So I think it starts with trying to create the kind of engagement of leaders. Now, I think that engagement, particularly for leaders who are like on the fence, is in part a movement of the heart. I think that's part of what you do in working with leaders. And then partly is presenting data. So if you can help connect a leader with her or his own life experiences and to realize where that sits in terms of equitable engagement, bias, etc., and then you can present hard data, I think you can often shift reluctant leaders. I say reluctant leaders because leaders who couldn't care less, I mean, that's a harder challenge, and in some ways, it may be impossible. But I think most leaders of organizations are either have some significant commitment, or at least they're reluctant and they're open to movements of the heart and the presentation of data.
Absolutely. I think that is directly the point there. The fact that there's so much HR data that is there to be able to tell the narrative differently than most of the leaders have ever been forced to look at it. Let's look at the history of it. In most cases, most people will hire those that they feel either connected to. There's some form of bias that they're looking for. In most cases, they will ignore the data if it's not presented to them and if it's allowed to move on. So how can HR and the data truly be used as a professional development standpoint for senior leadership? Because without presenting that, sometimes this is how they're going to get better. This is how they're going to be influenced by saying, well, before you hired this one person that we know you had your eye on, but we have 3 other candidates that has X qualifications, and there's an expanded view of looking at the position description a little bit differently than you have that we've seen from our data that we've been able to put together, and that might be a way that you can get it more productive. Let's open this up. That might get you past some of the conversations of 3 or 4 people sending something in and that's it, and you know you're not going to do it. If enough of those applicants on the street know that that organization is not known for doing that, then guess what? They don't apply. But now you've had this entire cycle now working against you, and then the excuse is then said, oh, well, we don't have qualified applicants. No, there's a role that can be there from the beginning, and professionally being able to teach, develop. That's a great opportunity that everyone here has because you own the data.
Yeah. And the data around implicit bias, particularly in recruitment, retention, and hiring, is so powerful. I mean, you don't have to convince someone in their heart of the fact that a man presenting something and a woman presenting the exact same thing in the same way, that the man has an advantage. I mean, it's incredible data, and one of the painful parts of that data is it hasn't changed much over the last few decades. While lots of other things maybe have shifted a little bit, I mean, some of the dynamics around gender and leadership, the data hasn't changed much.
So what are your thoughts on how to build a better understanding across an organization that recruitment is not just the responsibility of HR?
Well, you know, one of the strategies, you know, it's not rocket science, is that you look for talent regularly and constantly. And so anyone in the organization, hopefully in an organization that really is engaged in diversifying their organization, anyone can be on the lookout for excellent talent, as well as managers and supervisors always be on the lookout for excellent talent. When you go to manager and supervisor and you say, tell me who's on your list of people that you're tracking, and they tell you nobody, I mean, that can say something. You know, I know in the academy, someone graduates who's this incredible undergraduate student or a student with a master's degree, you know, somebody should be tracking that person, because 2 years, 5 years, 8 years from that moment, they might be an incredible candidate. And so I asked managers and supervisors, as well as anyone in the organization, you know, who do you think out there might be a great candidate, if not now, then in the months and years ahead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in thinking about what you were just, the great points you just made, Ben, and about what you've been discussing with what people did prior to 5/18, companies more and more throughout corporate America, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, they're pledging to take a bigger role in combating systemic racism. And people are saying that before that, as you were saying earlier, they failed to respond before this demand for change happened. So what is your recommendation for companies to keep their pledge as it relates to equity in hiring, pay, and promotion?
Well, I have four sort of guiding principles in my head, and there certainly is not an exhaustive list, but I think that the movements, particularly now, have to be bold. I mean, we can't be nibbling around the edges in ways that we've been doing for decades. And we're seeing some signs of that bold movement by some leaders and organizations. Secondly, I think the moves need to be specific and systemic. So, I think all of the moves that organizations take and leaders take should be measured up against, is this some fluffy word comment, or am I talking specifically about a change? And is that change structural or systemic? So it outlives the individual leaving and going for another job. The third is this action I'm about to take, are the results going to be transparent so that not only myself and my leadership, but other people in the organization can understand what the successes are and what the obstacles are. So transparency. And then last, some process of assessment or evaluation. So things that we've tried that might have worked 5 years ago, don't work now, you need to sunset. Things that you put a lot of resources into and they missed the mark, you need to try something else. So I think evaluation is critical, and not enough has happened in our nation. And I myself feel complicit in that some of what I've done over 50 years hasn't been rigorously evaluated. And so these are not things that I only suggest to leaders, I suggest to myself. Because if we're going to make a change of the heart and behavior, it includes all of us. And so confronting my own complicity is as important as helping leaders confront their complicity.
Point. So I have one more question for the panel, and then we're going to move on to question and answer. So anyone participating today, if you would like to go ahead and start asking questions in the chat, as I am asking panelists the very last question. And thank you to the three of you. You've done an amazing job. And they say that of 40 million things that are said, people remember about 40 of those. So from your lens and all that we've discussed and the questions that have been asked, what would you say HR's main role is in helping to facilitate the courageous conversations such as today to disrupt racial inequities in the workplace?
Well, I think HR professionals with their background are in a position to model the kind of courageous conversation, particularly if they're in a position to facilitate a conversation. At a time when conversations about race are challenging as they've always been, I think HR professionals are in a position to facilitate, and that facilitation should start with modeling the kind of openness and respectful engagement that we want from a group of people. And that takes courage. So in my work, I freely and openly share what I'm struggling with. And 50 years of work has gotten me to be in my infancy, struggling like everybody else is struggling. And that humility hopefully models for some people the kind of humility and openness and risk-taking that's going to help move us forward. So I think HR professionals are just, very well situated to facilitate conversations and to model the kind of openness that we need to move forward.
And I would agree with Ben's comment. I do think not every HR professional feels comfortable doing that.
Yeah.
But to be able to just act, whether they are pulling in a resource from somewhere else that could help facilitate those conversations, someone that has the right level of knowledge that they don't, where they could partner with that person. But as long as they're doing something to show and model that right behavior, I think that's going to be really important. My HR director and I have had some really intimate conversations about race and what we think we might be doing. And there's some discomfort there around, because I'm Black and he's white, trying to figure out, how do we do this in our workplace? And it's something that we've never done before. And we want to make sure we do this right. And I am a strong proponent of, well, then let's talk to an expert. Let's talk to others that might be doing this same thing and share some of our experiences, or bring groups together to have those conversations. It doesn't have to solely rest on the HR professionals to do this alone. But I agree with Ben, starting to model that right behavior and to act is going to be an important component of this too.
Thank you.
But let's be direct. If the employee base does not see it within HR, they're definitely not going to think that it's going to be within the rest of the organization. That is some of the, when I go say is that HR is the conscience, I truly mean that. Because in many situations, we look at a lot of these hiring practices and things that happen. In many of these cases, HR is who gets blamed. And it was not HR, it was this certain manager, it was this certain C-suite, that's what they wanted. But for the lay person who's watching what happens, in many cases, they look at HR. So I think there is a great role to set, a proactive role for HR to come out and courageously, once again, professionally develop, make those connections like Tracy and Ben are saying. Bring those different types of data and analytics that we do, but don't do it reactively, do it proactively in different ways. Create your own lunches and learns where it's not just wellness, but it's about HR principles and being able to truly teach these other leaders how they should actually analyze talent better, how they should have a succession plan that should be a goal, that you have an internal and external succession plan that you go over once a month, once a quarter, or something of that sort, so that you're always recruiting, like Ben says. All of those are proactive and creative, and it takes some courage to stand up. But that's what I define as the autonomous HR, and every employee needs the protection of the autonomous HR.
Thanks. I wanted to open it up now for questions. Thank you so much to the three of you for such insight. So I just wanted to open the floor up for questions that our attendees may have.
Hi, Benita. There's a few in the chat. If you want to take a look, John Healy wants to know: are there specific policies that you often see in the screening or selection process that create bias, intentionally or not, and should be rethought? John, if you want to add anything on that too.
As an organization, where the question comes from is, we've seen in many states, North Carolina not being one, you have to justify certain screening criteria in a background screen. So say a felony conviction, that it has to be specifically attributable to the work that is being done, not just a base criteria. And we're finding data is proving that people who are not screened out because of that criteria are performing equally well, even if they had a felony conviction. So we're specifically kind of on the hunt for what other screening criteria have maybe been a norm inside our organization or other organizations for a long time that need to be rethought and are creating bias inappropriately that we just didn't recognize.
No, that's a good point, John. Yeah. I remember years ago meeting this woman. Her girlfriend had asked her to drive her someplace because she had this car. And so she put a suitcase in there and, drove her someplace. The suitcase had a lot of cocaine in it. So here the person driving has a felony. I'm not sure if that's a person you should restrict from getting a job. So I think, like you say, we need to look at what someone has been convicted of. We need to think about the role of rehabilitation and not blanketly say if you have a record of any type, you can't enter the world of work again.
Hey, John, I would also add something that I know I've looked at stats at for years, credit checks. And if you've had many organizations that still did a credit check and they wanted to see even to a point of certain beacon scores, certain things that's on their credit. Well, lots of statistics have shown that there's not any strong correlations in many cases between certain things that show up on your credit and their ability to do the job that you need them to do. And it's been something that's been used as a barrier to weed certain people out. And you've seen some movement by some organizations that had to say, let's pull that off and let's look at different things as to if they are really going to be capable of doing this job.
And lastly, I'd just say, we do tend to, especially now during COVID, do a lot of interviews and screening through Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams. And I go back to my original assertion that not everybody has that high-speed access internet. So they're already going to be at a disadvantage even before COVID happened. And that can't be, the lack of their internet access should not equate to their ability to do a particular job. It just so happens that their particular area may not have that, or they couldn't afford that, which is why they're looking for a job. And so there's got to be other ways of meeting people where they are if, that they're seen as somebody that could be valuable to an organization, because that digital divide is really key. And if we're reliant so heavily on that in making our hiring decisions, that could put some folks at a disadvantage.
Thank you.
There's another question from Dana, wants to know, what systemic changes have you seen in organizations that have had a positive impact on adding more diversity in teams, changing the culture, et cetera? Systemic changes.
Well, the strategy I mentioned that, you can't pass go with a group of finalists until you have a conversation that essentially certifies that your search, which has put together this finalist pool, has been equitable, fair, and you have done an incredible job of looking broadly to increase the diversity of the pool. If you can't do that and pass go, then you go back and you reopen the search and you do a better job of searching for great talent from all sectors of society. So I think having that point where you can't pass go and sticking to it. So, you can't bend it if your friend of a friend is a finalist or someone who came from the same school, the same community. You've got to, with my own kids, when we get together, like for a dinner, they'll recount stories where their dad wouldn't give them an advantage because, their advantage is being in the home and hopefully me being a good father. It's not putting my thumb on the scale in the place of work that they want to join. So I think you've got to be courageous, and you've got to be equitable when you develop systems. You've got to stay with it, and it's not easy.
There was another comment in the chat. I don't know if it's so much of a question, but some of the reading and educating I've been doing talks about not seeing color. I know I was raised to say, we're all the same, we don't see color, but a lot of the reading I've been doing says, no, we have to acknowledge that, and that's at the root of the issue. And so I think this leads to, how do we in HR see color or not see color and understand and bring that into our informed changing of the culture?
Go ahead, Ben.
I'm trying to hold myself back.
And I think we need another hour for this one.
We need another hour for this.
Relearning.
I'll just leave it at my color, my experience as a Black man is part of who I am. You don't see my color, you don't see me, you don't see the experiences, Yeah. I want to be viewed as having potentially the same skills and competencies of someone of a different color, but I'm one color and the other person might be another color. And that's, racial identity isn't often the same for Black people and white people. I mean, we're struggling in a society for many white people to realize their racial identity, but most Black people know it. I remember having a conversation with an executive at a company I won't name. He said, Ben, you and I are both guys, we're both men. We like to do this, we like to do that. I said, yeah. And I'm a Black man. He said, I don't see color. I said, then you don't really see me. I said, your racial identity may not be important to you, but my racial identity is really critical to me and impacts my life path, my chances, as Tracy said, my safety, etc. If you don't see my color, then you don't see what my life experience was and is. But if we had another hour, we could talk more.
Yeah. Well said, Ben.
We are just about at our time. Benita, were there any closing questions that you had for the group or any other questions from the audience?
I would just encourage the group to take this rich discussion, the questions, the thoughts, and really think about what you each could do to become a better ally, to educate yourself, to see people's experiences and disrupt that thinking of, limitations that there may be, to really recruiting and retaining really good talent, to mitigate any type of racial inequities that are going on, and potentially, it may take also looking at doing a salary study, because that can a lot of times tell you what the inequities are across many different spectrums of diversity. So I just wanted to say thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to the panelists.
Yeah, so really appreciate you guys coming to Hacking HR today. We will be doing future events, and so if you have any thoughts on topics that you would like to discuss more, obviously we know that this topic could be discussed for many, many hours, and so it might mean that we will do a second installment next month. So stay tuned and be on the lookout for things like that. But we hope that you guys connect with us, both the Hacking HR community and the individuals that were here. One thing that stands out amongst the conversation is something that we recently talked about in our company. With it, it's no longer the golden rule, but the platinum rule. Don't treat others how you would want to be treated, but treat them how they want to be treated. And I think that's a big deal with these kind of conversations that we're having, is that you don't have to always agree on everything, but acknowledge and respect them how they want to be respected. So Really appreciate your time today, the panelists, Benita, for leading this conversation. And we hope that everybody has a fabulous weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
for having me.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.